I think we can go ahead and get started. The meeting is being recorded and it will be shared after for anyone that is joining late or not able to attend live. My name is Holly Johnson and I'm the program administrator for BayPath's post-professional OTD program. Our hot topic tonight is school-based occupational therapist roles in supporting transitions. And our guest speaker is Dr. Eric Surratt. He is an assistant clinical professor in the Doctor of Occupational Therapy program at Hanover College. He brings broad experience in school-based practice, geriatrics, memory care, and home health. His award-winning research in public policy complements his deep expertise in OT education and transitions for children with high-intensity needs. Throughout the presentation, feel free to submit questions via the chat, and we'll also have time for a Q&A at the conclusion. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Surratt.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for having me here this evening. I enjoyed putting this together. Again, this is an area of passion of mine. Hopefully some of you are doing this, but as we'll get into during this presentation, the research shows that OTs aren't involved in transition a lot, and we really should be. As I'll make the case tonight, this is right in our wheelhouse. So we should be on these teams, and we need to find ways to do it. So with that, can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, if there's no questions or comments, I'll go ahead and start with my presentation. Again, school-based occupational therapist role in supporting transition. So by the end of this presentation, I hope you can all articulate why it is important for OTs to remain on IEPs through secondary school and contribute as members of post-secondary transition teams. Also, that you're able to identify 6 primary evidence-informed approaches for promoting successful post-secondary transition for students with IEPs. And lastly, I want you to be able to share at least 3 ideas for how to incorporate evidence-informed methods into current transition practice. So, as we look at post-secondary transition, I really want to start with overview and definitions. And particularly, I want to ground these definitions in the law and education policy. So, we know that students begin actively preparing for adult roles during secondary school. And I say actively because, as we're going to talk about later, really, if we think about it, from the time a child's born, even from conception, we begin to think of our dreams and the future for this child. But as we know in elementary school, we use the term elementary for a reason because they're working on those foundational skills. But in secondary school, and by that we mean middle and high school, or as in my case, I went to a junior high, but it's those years combined. And during these years, you're starting to prepare yourself for different roles, including post-secondary education, paid employment, volunteering and community participation, home management and relationships, and let's not forget that, and health management. And again, these are the biggies, but it's by no way an exhaustive list. But we know that the transition to adulthood is challenging for all young adults. Think back to how excited yet nervous you were upon graduating high school and facing the life in front of you. I love to talk about how there's a whole cottage industry of books and movies and songs. They call them coming of age movies or coming of age novels. For my generation, I know The Breakfast Club was a big one that we all identified with. And I've seen over the decades, every generation has their coming of age novels and movies that really deal with that struggle to assume these adult roles. So this is really the biggest transition we face in our lifetime. We go through so many transitions, but this is really, I look at it as the mother of all transitions. And so those with IEPs or any kind of IEP diagnosis, they lose that IDA support and they experience significantly impaired outcomes. Now, based on the diagnosis category, some will struggle more than others, but the evidence is overwhelming, decades upon decades. This isn't kind of there's evidence leaning this way. It is case closed. Anyone who carries an IEP and a diagnosis in high school is much likely to struggle in adulthood, even if the diagnosis is speech language impaired. Yet, OTs tend to exit stage left just as dress rehearsals begin. So, this is when things get real, and this is when students really are facing that integration into all those adult roles. And at this moment, when our students need us the most, the evidence also shows that OTs were kind of washing our hands and walking away. So, as we're defining transition, let's first consider the laws that guide transition. So first of all, there's IDEA. So hopefully you're all aware of that, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we're going to refer that to a lot in the upcoming slides because we know for school-based practitioners, that is the big law that guides our practice. I like to tell my students, school-based practice is unique because it's the only practice I can think where your role is specified and guided by federal legislation. Also, let's not forget the ADA, especially when we're looking at transition. We're thinking about workplace accommodations and community access. And we really need to keep ADA in mind when we're working with these students and educate them on how to access and advocate for themselves. Then there's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So many may know that the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was the precursor for ADA, but it only applied to organizations that received federal funding. That's why but the law still stands, and that's why we have 504 plans in the schools, because schools are organizations that receive federal funding. And those 504 plans are also used in education, or many might not know that a child can qualify for a transition plan through a 504, even if they don't have an IEP. That is in the language of the law. Then we have our Common Core state standards. Again, we focus less on the actual educational end as OTs where there is a support or related service, but we do want to understand that. As we'll talk later, a predictor of success in adulthood is if we can help these children stay on a degree track for graduation. Then there's the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. And again, this law has really defined and expanded OT's role in transition. So this law goes beyond even IEPs, and it talks about any at-risk population needs to have money devoted and attention and services for transition. And OT is specifically defined within this legislation. So as you see, I stated earlier that OTs are exiting in these years when actually the legislation and the evidence is pointing us to be here. Like the legislation supports us being at the table. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But this law really expands our access to help transition. Like I said, we can provide transition services through 504 plans, and Every Student Succeeds Act even further expands our ability to provide these services to any at-risk population. Then there's the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008. This is a great law for a lot of our disadvantaged students, really promoted federal funding to programs for students with disabilities. I hope in the current environment that we continue to support this law. One statistic that I love is that since the implementation, and this statistic's a little bit old by now, but a decade after its implementation, enrollment in college programs by students with intellectual disabilities increased 500%. a 500% increase for anything is a massive impact. Then there's the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act. And if you are a school-based therapist, you need to, if you do not know this law, and hopefully many of you again are aware, but if you're not aware of this law, you need to tuck this one in your back pocket, because one of the big things this law did is it took our state vocational rehab agencies, and we know every state has their agency, but before this law, they pretty much worked as silos. And so there's that huge drop off of IDEA services. So a student graduates, you're out on your own, there's vocational rehab, good luck finding it. I'm in Florida, where I know a lot of that is the VR is accessed through the MedWafer program, and the waiting list is usually around 80,000 persons deep at any given time. So it can be very hard to access these services. Yet the WIOA mandated that vocational rehab agencies now must devote 15% of their budget to post-secondary transition before graduation. So they cannot any longer justify waiting and just filling the space after students lose IDA support. Under this act, vocational rehab has to, and they're mandated to work with high school children. And technically, VR should be involved in all IEPs to students that have transition with vocational related goals. I know that doesn't happen, but we need to understand the law and the intent of the law so we can argue for it and we can help make those connections, because this law very specifically, again, 15% of the budget is a nice little chunk of change that has to be focused on pre-graduation transition. Now, I want to look at the definition under IDEA of transition planning. Now, I kind of laughed when I made this slide because there's a lot of text on this. I'm breaking the rules of PowerPoint. Make another old guy reference like Judas Priest. I'm breaking the law, breaking the law. But you're going to have a copy of this PowerPoint. And so I put this specific language here for a reason, because I want you to be able to refer back to it. Because in my experience, a lot of OTs, we understand the spirit and the summary of IDEA, but we often actually don't know what the language says. And when we don't know the letter of the law, we can slightly misinterpret, sometimes to the detriment of our students, and it keeps us from making the most effective argument. So if you look at this definition, and I've abridged it a little bit, but the highlights are mine. So a results-oriented process focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the students with a disability to facilitate the movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, which we probably all think about, vocational education, that makes sense to us, integrated employment, continuing in adult education, here we're kind of iffy, but we're following you, adult services. But look at these last two, independent living and community participation. So it's not just vocational transition. And if only we had a profession that looked at the function of persons and occupations in context for independent living and community participation that could be on the IEPs and help these students meet these goals. What a great profession that would be. So notice the language of the law there. And it should be based on the individual needs. Again, I highlight this because unfortunately this doesn't happen. So based on the individual needs of the student with a disability, taking into account the student's strengths, preferences, and interests. What this doesn't say is that we take all the students to Wendy's and teach them how to wipe down a booth, then we take them all to the mall and teach them how to sweep the floor. That is not what a transition plan is. The evidence supports it. The letter of the law, not the spirit, the letter of the law says that this planning should be individual and strength and interest based. And this last one. So transition planning includes instruction, highlighted and underlined, related services, community experiences, the development of employment, and other post-skill adult living objectives, and if appropriate, the acquisition, again, daily living skills, and provision of a functional vocational evaluation. So as we all know, OT is a related service under IDEA, and it is right here in the language of IDEA. And if you need to quote it, I included the section of the law here. So if you ever get in a meeting and you have an administrator or someone saying, no, OT's role, this is outside of OT's role. IDEA doesn't support that. That's why I have the specific letter of the law. This is OT's domain, and we are a related service, and it is in the exact language of IDEA that we could and should be present in transition planning when appropriate. And when appropriate, I would say in a whole lot of cases. So now I want to talk about what I call the school-based OT hourglass. So you see in the top right corner there, I have this inverted pyramid. And again, this is how I've always, from the evidence and from my own experience, it's how most OTs view school-based service. So that top wide layer of the pyramid, that's pre-K when we're working on tying their shoes and going to the toilet and the lunchroom when we're going all to their special classes and we're going to the playground. It's pretty wide open. We can work on so much. Then, that next layer, they're getting in middle school or elementary school a little bit later on. So we're still doing a lot. We're focused on fine motor, still maybe some residual ADLs, but we're kind of starting to narrow our focus a little bit. Then you see that pyramid on the fourth layer, it narrows down. Now we're like late elementary, middle school. And now we're starting to call these kids up our caseload, and our focus is very narrow. We're not seeing a lot of kids. And then we get to the bottom of that pyramid, that point, and we're gone off IEPs. We see no role. But this is an image and a metaphor that I've always used with my students. And again, I call it the OT hour. So again, we know in those pre-K and early grades that funnel is wide. And we can capture a lot when we work on the school. We can't do everything. We're not working on bathing. That's not educationally relevant. But clothing management is pulling those pants up and down and washing hands, all those things. And I realize, and I've been there and I've done that, late elementary, middle school, we do pull back a little bit. We know by early adolescence, a lot of those fine and visual perceptual skills are starting to solidify. So we really got in there when those children had a lot of neuroplasticity. And now we're drawing back a little bit, taking a little less of a role. They're not as thrilled to be pulled out as this age or push in as we should be doing. But to be singled out becomes less fun. Your little kids, I was just in a meeting this morning. Your little kids love, like the ones that don't get to come to OT or speech feel left out. Not so when they get these middle school years. But if you look back,
but only for a little bit. They don't have to be your style.
Hello. Sorry, I think somebody's on mute. But then you see these late transition planning years. And if I were a better computer designer, I would have redone this hourglass to actually be wider on the bottom than on the top, because it's really wide open once they enter those transition years, what we can work on. Community integration, adult living skills, vocational skills, social skills, anything that they need to succeed in adulthood is now once again fair game to work on. So as this hourglass opens back up, this isn't the moment when we should be exiting these IEPs and having ourselves removed from services. So when does this planning occur and what exactly does it incorporate? So again, I included the exact language because I would venture to guess if I asked you in the chat to say, when does IDEA say transition should begin? Most of you would say, well, according to IDEA, it should start the year they turn 16. And I know with some states it's 14. But I want you to, again, my emphasis here, that is not what IDEA says. It says not later than the first IEP in effect when the student turns 16, or younger if determined appropriate by the IEP team. This language, it's subtle, but it's very important. Waiting till a kid is 16 to start thinking about their future is way too late. We've got a 5-alarm fire. The house is almost burned to the ground, and now we're sending the fire trucks. We're not going to save that much at this point. So we really need to be considering transition earlier than 16. I know some states say 14. I've heard rumblings that some states are going to go to 12, which warms my heart. I haven't heard it, so if you know of that, please let me know. I've heard the rumbling, but no actually proof of a state that's lowered their age to that age. But again, if the team makes the case, which we should have a little transition blurb there all along. In my own research during my dissertation, one of the things that I found is really the biggest transition for these students is going into secondary school. That again, we think about those coming of age movies and how hard it is going to middle school, and you always see the awkward kids getting picked on and left out. Amplify that times 20 for students with disabilities. So in my own research, I found that a lot of these students were very happy and well adjusted in the safety of elementary school. And I called the theme the adolescent earthquake. Once they went to middle school, their safe, secure lives, they used to love school. And all of a sudden now it's bullying, intimidation, confusion, falling behind, and they never really fully recover even to young adulthood. So again, this is a point I really want to emphasize. Know the language of the law. It does not say the year they turn 16. It says not later. This is the latest possible, not the best practice. Then the IEP must present a transition plan that includes appropriate measurable post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, and, where appropriate, that OT word, independent living skills. So it has to have planning. And again, hopefully, if we're doing OT right, we're the experts on writing those functional, holistic goals. And then, of course, we have to provide the transition services, including related services needed to reach these goals. And of course, as we know, the IEP still must be updated annually. But again, I have the section of the law here. So if you ever need to cite it, this is the exact language of IDEA and what it supports. So now, post-secondary transition planning and OT's role in transition. So now we know it's supported by the law. Why should we be there? What role should we take? So when it comes to transition, we bring a unique perspective on access and participation. Again, the more I'm around, the more I see that other professions just do not have that holistic look at access and participating in roles in all the many contexts that we consider. Context is one of my favorite OT words because it helps us understand so much about how persons function that so many other professions don't consider. Provide expertise in role participation. Again, I'm thinking about that MOHO language when I hear this. But again, we have that holistic training that provides broad perspective on roles. And we think about how these different roles are influenced by and influence occupation. When I teach these concepts, I always think of the term that's become popular, and it's probably been around longer, but in my awareness, the past couple of decades, you hear code switching a lot. And you usually hear that in terms of race. But when I think of that, and again, and I understand that concept, but I think really, if you think about it, we all code switch. We all act differently in different roles. I won't act the same in this call as I would if I was out to drinks with colleagues, as if I was out to drinks with some college buddies. We all switch the way that we act and participate in roles. And as OTs, we really understand that and think about how that affects our functioning and participation in our occupations. So we're experts in life skills training. So ADLs, IDLs, social participation, job readiness. When they're talking about these things on IEPs, why are OTs not there giving our 2 cents and our expertise? Again, we're really good at developing positive, future-oriented and student-centered goals. Again, I've just seen it over and I'm not like everyone has their role. I'm not knocking other professions, but other professions do not teach that client-centered perspective that we take on. And so I feel like we have a lot to offer in helping creating these positive, future-oriented and student-centered goals in those transition plans. And again, I also feel like our professional ethics make us really good at promoting student and family advocacy. Again, it's that client-centered perspective. We don't view ourselves as experts on a pedestal, raining down wisdom upon our clients. We see ourselves as collaborating with that they're the experts in their life. when I was in IEP meetings, I would try as much as I could to sit beside the family and not across from them. And I think that's how OTs practice, and we can help bridge some of those chasms. I often felt when I was in the IEP meeting, that was my role, was to almost bridge between the school personnel and the family. So now let's look at some resources and programs you can tap into. So if you've done any transition or in other roles, hopefully you're aware of OSARS, the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, which has a lot of great resources. It helps guide the implementation of IDEA. Now, traditionally, this has been under the Department of Education, and like Forrest Gump, that's all I'm going to say about that. And then under OSARS, there's INTACT. So the National Technical Assistance Center for Transition. So again, if you talk about putting your money where your mouth is, often, sometimes when I tell my students, if you want to understand what OTA is taken seriously right now, look at what they're providing these little 1 hour trainings on. I remember I was teaching 3D printing and AOTA was offering a training on it. I was like, that shows that AOTA sees this as the future. People are going to promote the things that they see as up and coming and important. So the fact that INTACT exists under OSARS shows just how vital they see transition planning. And really, we all should. Again, I have children, and I'm a pediatric OT. Like, I love children and kind of that sense of wonder of the world. I love experiencing through my daughter, her re-seeing things for the first time. But we have to understand that the point of childhood, all of childhood is a transition to adulthood where you're expected to function independently, and not just human, in any animal species. You have this period of childhood, and the whole point is for you to learn to fend for yourself as an adult. So we can't downplay the role there. Then these are some other resources. Project Search. I meant to look this up again. I'm pretty sure this is out of Cincinnati Children's Hospital. But again, I've not worked directly with them, but I've seen their work and I've been to their presentations, and it's a great program that provides 1 year job skills curriculum and on-site coaching and dedicated job skill courses. Then there's Think College, which has really helped promote, and these are outside private organizations, so promote inclusive higher education. And you can see some of the successes. I talked about the 500% increase in persons with intellectual disabilities. And they focus on job skills, but socialization and community integration. I want you to stop and think about that a minute, because it might seem obvious, but traditionally we thought of job skills just being rote performance. And so I picked this picture very much on purpose, and we would have these sheltered workshops where we would teach persons, particularly with intellectual disabilities, to perform the same tasks over and over. Now we understand, that's not person oriented, and that's not interest oriented, as we stated. But also, we've come to understand that rote performance of skills is not what a job is about. And that socialization and that community integration, all those soft skills, those social skills, those interpersonal skills are so vital to a job performance. We can't just teach rote tasks and expect someone to succeed. And I'm glad to see some people are working, running into these programs. I'm just monitoring the chat here, so great. Then there's Employment First, again, which is really advocated for the move from, again, the sheltered workshops to community employment. So, and they have sought to shift government dollars to job support and internships. So instead of, again, doing these sheltered workshops, which really, we'll talk about that in a minute, which really became exploitative traditionally, let's put people at work, pay them for their work, and support them on the job, and teach them, again, one of my favorite OT words, in context, how to perform. Because as we know, as OTs, we translate skills better when we practice them and learn them in the appropriate context. And again, go back to that roles, while assuming the actual role that we would need to assume in that context. So again, this is by no means exhaustive. These are just some of the big ones that I've run across. And of course, in addition to the 2 government agencies I mentioned. So now that we know OT's role, how do we contribute in an evidence-informed manner? because again, as we know, it should have always been important, but the importance of evidence in practice, being able to justify our practice, is growing. And so let's look at what the evidence says. So these 6 predictors indicate the best practices for facilitating successful transition. Now, I just, as a caveat, what I've read in the literature and by teaching this seems to be the 6 categories. We're going to look at another article that gets much more granular. So you might have seen resources that address these differently, but the heart of these are going to be the same. But from what I've seen in the transition literature, these are the 6 biggies and the way that we represent them. So we have early paid work experience, student involvement in transition planning, emphasis on social competence, development of life skills, use of assistive technology, and collaborative interdisciplinary and interagency teamwork. So first, let's look at early paid work experience. So hopefully we understand that work is critical to our identity, our self-worth, even our healthcare outcomes, and our quality of life. Now, there's been some pushback in the transition literature of what they call reductionistic neoliberal aims, like we all have to be productive cogs in the wheel. And I do understand that. We're going to talk about other things, and we said community integration, volunteer, all these other things are important. However, we cannot minimize the importance of paid work experience. We all complain about our jobs sometimes. Like, I know you get a bunch of faculty together, we're going to complain about we're so overworked. I know school-based therapists, you have a lot on your plate. We all will say some days that we wish we could quit and just win the lottery and sell off into the sun. It's human nature. However, I also point out to my students that complaining about work is the privilege of those who have access to the workforce. So if you are not able to build your identity and participate and feel like you're a functional member of society, that is much more crushing to our identity and our sense of self-worth than the struggles that we all naturally go through as part of our careers. So again, and you probably understand this if you've ever been unemployed for a long period of time, because I always say the only thing worse than having a job is not having a job. Kind of, there's a joke. I love my job, but hopefully you get the spirit of what I mean there. We have to understand how important this is. So achieving paid work and arranging it in secondary school is maybe the biggest predictor of paid employment after graduation. And this is a very important point. I said paid employment. Volunteering and unpaid labor does not predict or correlate paid employment in adulthood. Okay, exploitative labor and teaching people that your contributions aren't worthwhile and aren't worth us reimbursing you for does not promote job skills in life and does not predict employment, paid employment in the future. So it's a very important point, because so many times we've taken students and we put them in these let's send them out to volunteer and let's have them do this and simulate this and that. It does not correlate with, we're just teaching them that your contributions aren't worthy of being reimbursed. So we need to work with those vocational agencies and those community agencies to provide. Again, we can start with vocational education. So we do have to teach them before we send out there. And internships, maybe we're not starting with paid employment, but we also have to provide mentoring. And we'll talk about peer mentoring in a minute, which is the most effective. But then we can move towards supported employment, where we're supporting them in that paid employment. Customized employment, we can work to help create positions that meet their needs. And then work study programs, especially as we transition into post-secondary education. But you might even have those in your high school. So finding ways to use work study to pay students for their labor in this controlled environment. So next, student involvement in transition planning. So again, these numbers are hard to find, so I'm sure these vacillate. but roughly only 50% of transition age students participate in the IEP process. That is much too low. Now, I understand that, we do have students, and we work with students that have severe, profound disabilities. Some of them can't communicate. Some of them might remain on a very low cognitive level, but that's still not the vast majority of our caseload. So 50% is much too low to be involved in the IEP. And worse, only 10 to 20% take a leadership role. But evidence shows that when we put students in that leadership role, that they're much more likely to succeed in adulthood. So this is another Ericism that I like to tell my students. Because as professionals, we have to relinquish control, because you cannot teach independence through learned dependence. Just like you can't teach paid employment by keeping someone in indentured unpaid servitude, we also can't expect someone to take control of their life if we don't empower them when in a supportive environment to start taking that over. Doesn't mean we throw them in like the baby, like in the pool, and let them swim. But we need to gradually relinquish control and help students learn how to take control of their meeting. Because this is the perfect opportunity for us to teach them how to make decisions and how to advocate in their life. So you see this image that I provided in the corner. Where's Waldo? Because I Googled IEP meeting and I looked for images. I looked and looked and looked and looked, and I never saw a single image that had anything that remotely resembled a student. So it's like, really, when we're looking around, we need to learn, when we're conducting these meetings, we need to involve the students, and to whatever degree possible, start gradually putting them in the driver's seat. Not day one, but we need to slowly train and teach them in the supportive environment, so that transition team can promote self-determination through teaching them self-awareness and how to advocate for themselves. Self-directed choices and decisions. We're making decisions for their future. They need to be involved and start to take choice. Again, problem solving. This is the perfect setting to help have supportive problem solving. And then identify goals and develop that future vision. You're going to hear me use that term a lot, because that's another thing lacking in this population, is a real and coherent vision of where they're going. And part of that is our failing, because we don't treat students with special needs the way we do other children, and just naturally fall into that process of helping them cultivate, quote, what do you want to be when you grow up? Where do you want to live? What do you want to do? What does your life look like? Next is an emphasis on social competence. So social skills are the biggest predictor of a success in adulthood, not IQ, not grit, not, all of these factors we talk about. And those things are important. Resilience is important. But the actual biggest predictor is our ability to collaborate and work with others. We are a social beings in a complex culture. Yet these social demands, again, I talk about how severely they shift in those secondary years, and our students struggle with it. And then they're thrown into college and they're thrown into employment. And again, there's another radical shift on these expectations. So persons with deficits, and again, we find that, but for a myriad of reasons that I can't get into here, even persons with physical disabilities will strongly correlate with social skills deficits. Sometimes it's, again, environment, physical, contextual exclusion, different factors. But for many reasons, persons with deficits particularly struggle again with that hidden curriculum in college and even at work. So that term hidden curriculum is used a lot in the literature. And that's being able to come up to the professor and advocate for your grade, or ask, be able to check. I don't understand this assignment. Am I doing this right? How do I pick the best classes? How do I set my schedule so that I'm not late getting from one class to the other? Understanding that I can't have a 9 to 10 class on one side of campus, then a 10 to 11 on the completely other side of campus. So all those little hidden social things that other students pick on naturally, a lot of times our students need support for that hidden curriculum. Now, we need to start early, even when focusing on other goals. So again, I said earlier, 16's too late to begin. Even when I was in pre-K, and again, we have these inclusive pre-Ks now, and even when I'm working like in kindergarten, first grade, when I would be working, even if it was like social skills, handwriting skills or fine motor skills or whatever, I would still incorporate their peers in these activities because it's a chance for me to model and promote social integration because we have to start then. We need to start when they're in preschool and in kindergarten. We can't start thinking about this when they get to high school. So again, OTs, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I never just did, like, even if there's not a goal, it doesn't matter. Like that whole IEP should develop somewhere, be talking about socialization, and we can work on fine motor skills or perceptual skills or whatever it is and still promote those skills. And when they're young, it's great because a lot of times, again, these kids are excluded. And when they're young, kids love to be included. They love special activities. So when you let them pick 3 friends, you've given them social capital that they don't have. Now, with adolescence, that changes. They don't want to see us. They don't want to be called out. The worst thing in the world when you're out, it's like you could either be called out in front of your peers or in the universe as we know it. And most adolescents would be like, let's just end the universe and be done with it because I do not want to be embarrassed in front of my peers. So with adolescents, we need to then shift and use peer mentors because these are the most effective teachers. And there's so many reasons why students will volunteer for this, for part of a club, or because they had a sibling or a family member with a disability, or they want to put it on a college application, whatever reason, they just enjoy the challenge. You will find that there are students that are willing to take these roles, and we need to identify and train them to train our students at that point. But those soft skills should be addressed, as I spoke earlier, in supported employment and post secondary education. So we have to, again, remember those subtle soft skills and not just focus on the big and the obvious. Next, development of life skills. So life skills they're life skills. It's right there in the name. It's critical for adult success. It's the skills we need to do life. Therefore, they become educationally relevant during transition. Now, independent living skills are often offered as an alternative curriculum, often for students who aren't on a diploma track. But we can still find ways to address these, but we do need to understand that. And definitely for those that aren't on the diploma track, we should absolutely be there addressing these. So remember again my image of the school-based hourglass, that these services broaden again in these years. So again, this is our jam. I've always kind of joked someday I'd like to do some continuing ed on this and have jars of jam and pass it out when somebody gets a right answer about how we can be involved. Because I'm not going to read all these, but you should know these. Like these are life skills that we can focus on. Don't tell me that OT doesn't have a role in post-secondary transition when this is the core of what we do. This is our jam, people. Then implementing assistive technology. Hopefully this doesn't surprise us, but evidence proves that AT can promote independence. So as the teams, and we know that has to be addressed earlier in the IEP, but now we need to apply it to transition. So we need to assess those needs and integrate into broad roles and performance categories. So again, I say that because that doesn't mean just jobs to perform, again, those rote tasks. Think of those larger social skills and emotional skills, organization, time management, all the different ways, communication. So we need to think broadly about using AT and not just using a robotic arm to move something from here to there, or using a computer program to calculate a spreadsheet. It's beyond rote job performance to all performance categories. And particularly, one of the great advantages of technology is it's great for empowering job coaching and immediate emotional support. Again, we can always do job coaching, but you had to be on site. But now through technology, through FaceTime and Zoom and different methods, just like we're doing this at a distance, if someone needs immediate social support or coaching, they can reach out and contact you. And it makes it very seamless to provide greater support. And the evidence supports that this really increases outcomes. But always consider the potential and social stigmatization. So we have to think about how we incorporate it, which is why universal design is so great in reducing stigma. So I mentioned things like FaceTime, and you see this picture of the person on the iPad. I would tell you, I was at ATIA, the National Assistive Technology Conference in January, And Google had their booth, and I think Facebook had a booth, and I don't know all some of these. I think Android had a booth. People, I'll tell you, Apple is in it to win it. Apple didn't have a booth. They had multiple classrooms. They had presentations running all day long. They are trying to do everything. And usually I'm not a big fan of corporate consolidation, but we know how expensive some assistive technology can be and how hard it can be to access. And again, the stigma. But man, with your iPhone and your iPad, they're looking at vision and hearing and cognition and time management, speech. I mean, I think the Toby Dynavox people are probably panicking at this point when they see what where the iPad is going. So just know that it's pretty exciting to see what we can do with everyday devices everybody has. Now, I'm not going to say that an Apple device is cheap, but $800, $1,000 is cheaper than $30,000 for Toby Dynavox. And I'm not knocking them. I love what they do. And I work with them too. But the point is that some of this technology is so hard to access, but we're seeing some of that now really be incorporated. Again, we all know we have the accessibility options in our computer and on websites, and it's amazing how far it's gone now. Lastly, interdisciplinary and interagency teamwork. So interdisciplinary teams have proven to be more effective, and it's required by IDA. It's in the language. So again, that doesn't mean the teacher, the special education teacher, the parent, and the LEA. It says interdisciplinary. We need multiple disciplines there, and OT should have a seat at that table. Now, ideally, you should involve a community agency, which makes that team interagency. Now, again, I'm a realist. I understand that establishing these links can be difficult, and it's going to take time, it's going to take effort in the front end. But it is so vital to success, and the evidence shows that it's so beneficial for our students. But we need to define the roles of those interagency participants very clearly, but understand that these community partners understand the community needs so much better than we do. And again, it's networking. We're connecting to them. So we're not sending everyone to their business, but they will better be able to understand the marketplace and help us identify other businesses. And rather than us cold calling a business in the community, this community needs to be like, yeah, I know somewhere at this art studio. I can call and see if they have an opportunity because it sounds like your student really has an interest in that. But even beyond interagency, we need to clearly designate the responsibility on these teams for goals and training. And this almost goes against what I teach because I always say there's no such thing as OT goals or PT goals in the IEP. They're the student goals, and we all should support them. And we still need to view it that way. But we also understand that OT is going to focus on these goals while supporting the whole IEP. And the same with transition planning. We need to make sure everybody understands who is implementing what part of that, though agreeing that we're all reinforcing it together. But I just have my emphasis here, you do there. And if we're not explicit, again, evidence shows that often these tasks fall between the cracks. And again, we want to work together to collectively build that positive future vision. So now, and I want to actually thank Holly brought this article to my attention. It's amazing how you can scour the literature with a fine-tooth comb and still find a great resource that you missed. But this article was a really thorough, systematic review that found 23 predictors for transition success. And this is a pretty broad, building on some previous systematic reviews. So this is pretty high-level evidence here. Now, I want to point out that many of these, if you look over this list, you could put these as subcategories under those 6 categories that I just went through. So I think it still holds true. So if you could start with those 6 broad categories in mind and then really start to drill down to these 23 more specific predictors, I think would be a great way to approach it. But I did highlight a few things here. So notice the exit exam and the high school diploma. So the education track does matter. Now, we're not the primary drivers of that, but we are on these IEP teams. And so we can bring evidence to the table that keeping that person on a higher level diploma track, it will have is a greater predictor for post-secondary success. Again, inclusion in general education. I know we're always advocates for that. I know this is a time when people are wanting to cut back. And again, this is evidence that helps us make that argument. We can save money in the short term, but by excluding these students from general education, then we're making it more likely that the rest of their life they're going to be depending on social services. So let's put the effort on the front end where we can make the change. And then these next ones go back to that what I was talking about taking control of the IEP team. So self-determination and advocacy, autonomy and decision making, psychological empowerment, self realization. So it's so important that we teach these students not only, again, rote skills, but we help them take control and we model and make them feel able to take control of their life and not take control of their planning and then throw them out in adulthood and say, gee, why are you not suddenly taking control of all your life after we've made all the decisions for you for 22 years? And then the last one I wanted to point to was career awareness. And again, this is one I saw in my own um, research and one I want to continue to explore in research. Because again, I have a daughter, and from the time she was little, she's playing dress up and she's talking. She's 5 now, and she loves all these girly things. So she instead of a spa, she calls it a spa, but she says, when I grow up, I want to work in a spa where you put cucumbers on people's eyes. Really cute, that'll probably change over time. But the point is that we talk about that. Where do you want to live? What do you want to be? And we don't go through that process with our students with disabilities. And we need to help them and talk about it and also steer them more realistically. Everybody wants to be a sports hero or a rock star. You're always going to be a rock star or a famous novelist, but I'm an OT professor. But you can take these goals again and steer somebody. Okay, you like music. Why don't we look at jobs like maybe somebody's like really good with technology with a recording board, or there's so many ways you can get involved. So maybe take those big dreams and help them focus it. Okay, so this is our last section. I know we're running close, but I want to talk about the pragmatic. How? So if you noticed, I put a little pie in the sky up there because I've been at both ends of these trainings, and I know the challenges we all face. As school-based practitioner, as professors, we're all pulled so many ways. So I do understand all we can do is teach and strive for the ideal, but I've kind of put that kind of pie in the sky as a joke. So let's see how we can make this happen. So first, we have to embrace the C word on our IEPs. And I know that's become a dirty word, but it's because we've given up control of that word and let it become so. So there's nothing wrong with the word consult. We have to embrace this word and understand that it's an action verb. So the reason consult has become so controversial is we've used it as a passive verb. We're going to use that as a placeholder on the IEP to transition off the IEP, to placate the parent for whatever reason. Like it's not a passive word. Again, I'm here as part of this grant as a consultant. So you can see I'm actively involved. I'm doing something. I put a lot of time and passion in this presentation. So this allows us to stay on the team, but we have to explain our role. So again, and we're going to get that pushback, and we're not going to win everybody over. Again, I've went through this process, and it's like Linus in his little blue blanket having those exact minutes. But we need to explain to parents that that's not our role now. But it is, we do have a role. Again, I found usually with a consult that I'm putting a lot in the beginning and the end of the year, when a lot of times, like at the beginning of the year, our students are still not coming out of class yet. They're still getting settled at the end of the year. They're on field trips here and there. That's when you put a lot of that work, training teachers and working with community agencies and doing that. So we have to put in the legwork and take this back and show that consult is an active verb, that we want to be on the IEP teams, that their fine motor and visual perceptual, a lot of these skills are pretty much coalesced at this point. I'm not taking them away from their academics 30 minutes twice a week to play with the Tinker toy. What I'm doing is here as a consultant is working in the big picture and working with the team and helping train others how to help your student. Think what I said about peer mentors. So that being said, I understand the time crunch is real. This is the best image I found. Is a school-based therapist, you feel this when you get your caseload every fall. This is what it feels like being an academic when they want you to wear 37 different hats at once. But we do have to advocate with administrators. So begin with IDA and transition law. When they say OT doesn't belong there, that's why I gave you the specific law in the section you can point them to. Again, a lot of people like to give you pushback when you speak in generalities. When you start quoting sections of laws, you see some kind of like, you see them back up. It's like, oh no, I better look this up and make sure, kind of like checkmate, I got you. No, actually, this is what the law says, related service, it's on there. And then follow up with the evidence. Again, we have all this great evidence, and I've given you research about what evidence shows produces these outcomes. So again, when you come in with specific articles and you can quote dates and articles and studies, it makes it much harder for someone to dismiss you when just saying, well, we know, like I'm an OT, we know that transition services help students. No, use the law, use the evidence. Because again, this is not going to happen overnight. But if we continue prune our caseload, it justifies our exclusion. So we have to advocate. If we keep cutting these kids because, and I know we're all busy, if we keep doing it, they're happy to sweep it under the rug, and we got to quit giving them the broom. So we've got to educate our teachers about our roles. Again, I learned about this in school, and I was like, it makes a lot of sense. Why are we leaving? Again, why are we exiting the stage right as dress rehearsal begins? So when I showed up in my high school, it's like, hey, I'm in the OT. I want to work with you in transition. They're like, we don't really work with OTs. I was like, well, that's going to change. And once they started again, but it's working with them again, just like parents, not telling them this is what you should be doing with your classroom. Once I started working with them to develop goals, develop programs, then they loved it. And they're like, oh, come, how about this? Can we do this? So you educate and show that work. And again, empower our families to access these services. So our takeaways. OTs have a role on transition teams supported by IDA and other laws. This is the biggest transition of a lifetime, and our students are struggling, but we are uniquely skilled to meet the challenge, so we can't exit when we're needed the most. We must advocate and educate regarding our place at the table. So evidence supports our role and guides our intervention. Again, I have great evidence here for how we should practice. So we have to be the change and not the bureaucratic enabler. So this little quote I always love to include, but I know we're running over, so let me open up to questions real quick. Again, you'll find lots of resources there on the reference page if you download that PowerPoint. So sorry, we went quicker out of practice, but always it goes longer when you get talking and really.
If anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or just raise your hand or come off mute. You're welcome to do any of those.
Anyone, if not, again, I know we're going to transition. I don't think everybody's going, but I know we're having a discussion for certain participants afterwards.
Yes, and we'll go ahead.
Well, first of all, actually, in our district, we are starting a transition team. Unfortunately, in our district, we have 4 people in our transition services. So we really believe that OTs and PTs should be part of this too. I actually start asking parents in 6th grade where they see their child when they graduate, and I get that deer in the headlight look. But I want them to start, thinking about it. But one of the biggest challenges we're finding is these parents can't get past writing the paragraph when it comes to middle school and high school. And just, do you have any advice on how to steer them more into this direction if we need to start preparing them for life after high school?
Yeah, that is a tough process, and I know we get pegged as that writing specialist. That's again, I think, just broadly why we have to educate and talk about it, and I think make sure that we're addressing that because that is a concern, and we're doing writing. Pointing out that most people don't make a living writing. So, talk about again assistive technology and how important that is for success. So I think it is starting again, listening to them and hearing their concern. And I think I find it's like listening to read between the lines. So, okay, writing. What's so important about, like, okay, we're talking about writing, but what is it you want them to do? To write for what? And I think that's when again you talked about talking in sixth grade. I think that's a great way to get them from that deer in the headlights look to where they're going, because most likely when they're so focused on writing, they're thinking of all these other things that they want them to be able to do as an adult, that they want them to be independent with, but it's just they don't have the vernacular or the perspective. So I think it's making sure that we're addressing that and listening to it, but just constantly kind of and explaining that role of OT. And I know that feels like a general lesson, but was always explaining. I gave you that example of showing up in the high school class, and again the teachers were like, that wait, OTs, we don't work with OTs, but taking that time to really explain our role and show them. And like, even if it's those small victories, again, if you can, and again, and I know a lot of you know this, we've got a lot of practitioners, but when you solve a problem for someone, when you make their life a little bit easier, they're going to come back to you. And I found that in every job I have. If you listen and kind of read between the lines and really figuring out what that issue is, and you can find just some little way to make their life easier, then you've got that door open. Then they're going to come back, and it's like a drug, like give me more. Like that was so, again, and it sounds like you do that, and I'm glad to hear you bring up that future vision. But I think the other thing with that too is we have to work with our teams so that our teams understand our role and aren't presenting us as handwriting specialists. And we have to do a lot of work in the schools to, it's nothing. I don't mind doing writing. Writing's very important, and I don't mind doing it, but kind of, again, explaining and expanding that role.
Lauren, did you have a question?
Hi, good evening. I had a quick question. I work for the New York City Department of Education. Transition is a very big thing for us. I work in a middle school, high school. I noticed that a lot of students coming into the middle school, transition is like a whole new way for the parents and teachers. How do you think we can address this on more of a higher stakeholder level, like with the administration, with the school districts? Because me as an OT, I often get overlooked and dismissed, and I have to, kind of include myself and tell them, listen, I can help you do this. If he's going to a work site, I can help him get work site prepared. So what's another idea?
Yeah, like again, that's why I said I think that advocacy and that education of our role. So, you'll have this presentation, take, and the resources, again, we're all standing on the shoulder of giants. So take this, piece together some of these resources. And I would be proactive in going to them, say, hey, can I get into the district meeting or some of these trainings that we do, and kind of explaining to them. And again, it's why you go back to those early slides that I give you the specific language of IDEA and where you can point to. Because when you say it, again, it's one thing to say, hey, we can be involved. But again, when you say, listen, this is transition based services, and look at section, and I can't quote the section off but section like 93B of IDA actually says that we must provide services, including related services. You understand that under IDA, that OT is defined as a related service. So especially when you're talking about that higher level, again, with our parents and that earlier question, we really want to be functional and based, and we want to kind of bring that language down to earth. But when we're dealing with administrators, again, that's what I said. I love that term code switching. And I think we do it in more, I think everybody does in some roles. So I think when you're dealing with administrators, you are going to change how you interact. And then, instead of being so kind of direct and functional. Not that we don't want to be functional, but you're going to go and use some of that higher level language and that education and speak the language to them that they're using. And I think make some of these arguments too. Like I said, that's why I pointed out in that one slide how some of these predictors like traditional track and inclusion education increase outcomes. So again, a lot of times I speak the language of my audience, like, well, we're trying to save money. And it's like, well, we're investing a little money here, but the evidence actually shows it's paying off in the long run. So it's kind of like you can skip changing the oil in your car and you can save $60 now, but that new engine's going to cost you several thousand. So I would suggest that. I think lunch and learns, advocate, like ask them, can I come and speak, and kind of being in their ear. And again, you'll have the reference page there. To access some of these articles and bring that evidence. Again, I still believe in sometime in, like, I don't like to kill a lot of trees, but when you walk in and like put a couple of research articles on the table that have certain things highlighted, especially in a context like that, it makes an impact. People listen. It's much easier to blow you off when you're like, yeah, but look, actually here, like, this is, this is our evidence. This is what the federal government says. This is what the law says.
Thank you.
I also saw some questions in the chat. How do you accommodate for students who are in a competence-based learning high school environment?
Yeah, again, competence-based learning, you're focusing on those skills. So, again, I think it would be rolling what skills are they teaching and how can we apply that to transition. So again, as we said, life skills usually are taught in, if someone has a life skills curriculum, it's usually through an alternate curriculum. So I think it's really just talking to those teachers and identifying the role and saying these students are still covered by IDA. What are these? What are these competencies? How is it going to apply in life? And to me, that's a great bridge for you, because again, we look at those roles, we look at context, we look at holistic intervention. So my fear was something about competence-based learning. Would it be that it could become too narrow? Now, you're more the expert in that than mine, but I could see that maybe becoming almost too focused and not, again, as we said, transitioning. So I I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you would be able to come in and say, okay, we're teaching these very specific skills. How is this going to help them when they graduate? And again, now you have these evidence base that you can learn, and you can say, listen, this is what the evidence shows going to prepare them. So how can we use these approaches to take these competencies and apply them to roles? And again, if you start getting those community agencies, can we start to find places in the community where these skills can translate? So does that make sense?
And the last question I see, how would you involve a student that has significant cognitive delays in transition teams?
Yeah. So we have to be realistic, but first of all, I would have them there. I would, that student, and involve them. This is a big rule that I always had too. So I worked in schools, I also worked in memory care. Even if I know that somebody can't respond, I don't know what's going on. So whether this is a child with a severe kind of disability or an adult with dementia, I talk to them and I ask them and I respect them. If they can answer, the caregiver will always step in, right? But if you ignore them, nobody else is going to draw your attention to them. So again, I do understand that, not everybody's going to go out and work 40 hours a week, but we still, and I know the kind of supported living situations and the continuum that these students end up in. But, even if we just have them at the IEP and we talk to them, and if they do have basic communication abilities, talk about their interests and what they like, and then again, work with the teams, work with the families. So again, as we know, we have to, as OTs, we're client centered. Everyone has different ability levels. But like I said, unless someone is just behaviorally disruptive, I would advocate, for that family, if possible, to have them there and involve them in any way you can at their level. Because again, that is another belief that I feel very strongly about, is that dignity. And I always would stop a student or somebody else, like, if you're, even with kids, like even typically developing kids, if I'm there and, and I hear some people talking to the parents, what does Johnny like to do? What does Jill like to do? It's like, I don't know. Let's ask them. They're right here. So I think it's just finding that level. And again, making that bridge to whatever level they're at, and you're still going to work with that family. And again, we're a great source of resources. So even if they don't have a vocational future or vocational path, it's working with them to find out their ability levels and just make them feel respected. And then we can work with that family to be resources, again, understanding some of those transition, because this is the other thing that my research found that kind of surprised me is they talk about the IDA cliff, and parents repeatedly report like feeling like it's like I fell off a cliff, it's like I fell in a black hole. These families are used to getting support, but when I went out and started interviewing young adults with ID, like intellectual disabilities, like I said, I found that to them, the disorientation came when going to middle school. Like leaving high school sometimes was a relief. So it's those parents that really depend on the IDA resources. So we can involve that kid and deal with the parents and whatever that vision is, but we want to aim as high as possible. And I think that is the problem is like, I understand, again, that's why I put my little pie in the sky joke. I know it's not a perfect world. I know we're not going to keep everybody on our caseload. I know that everybody's not going to live independently and work 40 hours a week. But I think we're still guilty of aiming too low and not, I mean, I'll be honest, we all have implicit bias. Like I was kind of shocked when I first read that statistic about persons with intellectual disabilities increasing by 500% in college. I just did double take when I read that. And I was like, well, that's my own implicit bias if I'm assuming that they shouldn't have a role in higher education. So it's kind of challenging ourselves to raise the bar to whatever is possible. But again, but also be realistic. We don't want to give family false hope, but but the bigger problem is always underestimating the abilities and the prospects for so many of our kiddos.
It sounds like everyone feels this was very helpful. So thank you so much, Dr. Surratt, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. To the attendees, thank you so much for joining us tonight. As I said in the chat, I will be sharing the recording and the slides with everyone, and I'll also be sending out some CEU letters. Feel free to contact me with any questions. At this time, we're going to transition to a closed professional discussion with our OSEP grant mentors and mentees. So we are asking everyone else to please log off. But again, thank you so much for joining us tonight.